It is now 116 days since the terrible massacre which took place on October 7 in southern Israel, where more than 1,200 Israelis were brutally murdered and another 250 were abducted by the terrorist organization Hamas into Gaza. In the Jewish world, there is a clear before and after October the 7th, as Israelis are struggling to come back to some form of normality. To assess the political and military situation in Gaza and Israel at the moment, we have two prominent guests in the studio today. I say welcome to Anders Vistisen, Danish member of European Parliament, and Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of the British troops in Afghanistan. It's a pleasure to have a British person in this studio again after so many years. So you are very
pleasure to be here.
Very warmly welcome. Colonel Kemp, if I start with you, as I mentioned, you've been the commander of the British troops in Afghanistan. Today you are a military and a political expert. You have written extensively about the situation in Israel, but also, more importantly, you have been there several times after October 7, boots on the ground. Let me ask you a very pointed question, especially in light of what happened at the International Court of Justice in The Hague just a week ago. Is Israel committing a genocide against the Palestinian people?
I think the South African allegation is actually an obscenity, because the reality is that Israel is fighting against a genocide of its own people. Hamas have declared in their founding charter, which has never been abrogated and which is constantly reinforced by the words of their leaders, that they intend to destroy the Jewish state and to either kill or remove all of the Jews from the land of Israel. And not only that, but they intend to go further and kill Jews around the world. They are truly a genocidal organization, and not only their words, but also their deeds. We saw it on the 7th of October, which I think some people have characterized as an example of one day in the Holocaust, with the kind of actions that we saw carried out by the Nazis, carried out by Hamas against the Jews in Israel during the 7th of October. And those two things, their intent and their actions, demonstrate their genocidal characteristics. Israel, on the other hand, is trying to fight against that and defend against that. And there is nothing at all that would suggest that Israel's policies are genocidal, either their policies or their actions. The leadership of Israel has repeatedly made clear that their war is against Hamas, not against the Palestinian people. Their actions have backed that up, in effect. They've done everything they can, everything in their power, and more than most armies would, to prevent the deaths of innocent civilians, of innocent Palestinians, while doing their best to destroy Hamas as a threat to Israel. So it's completely the opposite of the allegation that's been made. And in fact, I think the International Court of Justice felt the same thing. They should have dismissed the charges of genocide against Israel. They didn't do that, for I think more for political reasons than legal reasons. But what they did do is that they effectively acknowledged that Israel is in the right to be fighting against Hamas, and they're not committing genocide because they did not do what the South Africans asked them to do, which was to call for a ceasefire and to stop hostilities. The Court of Justice did not do that. All that they did, really, was to tell Israel to continue doing what it's doing, which is avoiding a genocide. So there was nothing, there were no indications that the International Court of Justice felt that there was anything in these allegations. And in fact, the one positive action that they did require was for Hamas to release all of the hostages, which of course is not going to happen unless, not by order of the court, unless Hamas is forced to do so.
Thank you. And Anders Vistisen, there was a vote very recently in the plenary session in Strasbourg on the same issues. There were calls for immediate ceasefire, but that call was rejected and there was placed conditionality. in order for Israel to stop its military operation. But coming back to the same provocative, perhaps, question, is Israel committing a genocide?
No, I don't see any indication that Israel is not trying its best to limit the number of casualties, civilian casualties in Palestine. I would say if such an efficient military would commit atrocities against the civilian population, the damage would have been much higher when it comes to such a densely populated area. I think if you look at the number of bombs that Israel has dropped, the ratio is one dead per bomb almost. I think let's not let's signal that if highly efficient military, if they wanted to escalate, if they wanted to have the maximum amount of Palestinian death, they of course would have been able to do a much more terrific damage with that level of bombing. So I think that in itself is a signal that you're trying to make precision bombing in a very difficult environment, because Hamas have an interest to drive up the number of civilian casualties. They hide in civilian infrastructure. They hide behind also in UN structures, we know. They hide in schools, they hide in hospitals. But they also, of course, do not wear a uniform. So it's very, very difficult in that kind of environment to fight a war. I think that is not acknowledged by any power who have tried to fight insurgents, tried to fight terrorist organizations. And that is tremendously much harder when we are talking about one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So of course it's not an easy military operation, and of course civilian casualties should be avoided. But in these circumstances, I think they are doing what they can.
Thank you. And again, Colonel Kemp, we had an interesting briefing last night with EU ambassadors, and you went into great detail to explain how IDF is preventing civilian casualties. You are also on the record of having stated that IDF is perhaps the most human of all armies of the world, and you've seen a lot during your long career. How would you substantiate that claim, and could you give us some examples of how Israel is preventing civilian casualties?
Yeah, well, as we've just heard, Hamas deliberately set out to lure Israel into killing Palestinian civilians in Gaza. That's Hamas's policy. They want, when almost every action they carry out, whether it's rocket attacks, tunnel attacks, any other attacks against Israel, they want Israel to respond by attacking Gaza and killing Gazan civilians. And they do that in order to, it's the first time I think in history any army has deliberately set out to force its enemy to kill its own civilian population. And they do it in order to vilify Israel, isolate Israel, and delegitimize Israel in the eyes of the world. And in that situation, it is very difficult for the IDF to eliminate Hamas as a threat while minimizing civilian casualties. But they work very hard at it, and they do more, I think, than any other army that I've ever certainly witnessed to minimize civilian casualties. I was on the ground in Gaza a few times since this war began, and I witnessed with my own eyes the measures taken by Israel to prevent civilian casualties. I attended a command committee meeting inside Gaza with three IDF generals, who spent about an hour discussing future operations. 20 minutes of that hour were taken in talking about how to minimize civilian casualties in a specific area. Now that is an indication of the emphasis that the IDF put on that mission to minimize civilian casualties. They have what they call a civilian harm mitigation unit in Southern Command in Israel, which is a group of specialist officers whose intention is to work out and to advise the chain of command on how best to minimize civilian casualties. And just a few examples of how they go about this. From the air, they've dropped millions of leaflets, which include maps showing Gazans where they're going to be attacking, where are the dangerous places, where are the safer places to go, what routes to take to get there, all in Arabic. I've seen these maps. They're very clear. They're dropped all over Gaza whenever necessary to warn the people to leave certain areas. They've made millions of telephone calls, voice messages, text messages to Gazans, telling them to leave certain areas. And so these are just some of the steps they take. And the The Hamas, meanwhile, are receiving the same information, of course, which gives them an opportunity to get out of the area as well, which is obviously a very much a negative from Israel's point of view, but again shows the fact that they're willing to give some kind of benefit to the enemy in order to minimize civilian casualties. And Hamas are trying to prevent them leaving and often have killed people that are planning to leave or indeed threatened them at gunpoint to stay. So they're the ones that are committing war crimes here. That's a war crime to prevent civilians from leaving a danger area. And on the ground, the same kind of situation applies. IDF soldiers have a very strict set of rules of engagement which tell them when they can and can't shoot at individuals, when they identify that they're terrorists. If they're not identified as terrorists, then they're not allowed to kill them. And I've questioned Israeli soldiers from the top to the bottom in Gaza. They all understand this. And from everything I saw, they carry it out. Of course there's going to be mistakes. Of course there's going to be sometimes civilians killed when they shouldn't be killed. But that, unfortunately, is the nature of war. Overall, I don't think you'll find any army that goes to the extent that Israel goes to minimize civilian casualties in battle.
Well, I'm very grateful of the fact that we can host you here in the European Parliament today. You will be speaking in a few hours to members of the European Parliament. And as I mentioned, you spoke to EU ambassadors last night, and this is long overdue that they get a military assessment of people who actually have been there. And may I also add people who are not Israelis, because you are an independent observer in that sense. If we come back to Denmark and looking at the developments of the last few days, actually, very interesting that led by the US and UK and Finland being early on taking the lead to actually freeze funding to UNRWA, the UN aid agency to the Palestinians, something which we have asked for many years, actually, because we see how dysfunctional UNRWA have been in delivering aid and how embedded Hamas is in the whole civil infrastructure in Gaza, including and perhaps even especially in UNRWA. Defunding or freezing funding to UNRWA this time, is this the right decision? I believe that the EU has also joined this growing number of member states. There's France, Germany, UK, Italy, Finland. Denmark is not on the list as far as I can see. But Mr. Vistisen, is this the right decision, and if so, why?
It's a very late decision, but you shouldn't complain if people eventually take the right decision. Unfortunately, the NGO support and UNRWA support for radicalized element within Palestinian society is a thing that goes back decades, and we have time and again put forward these stories, the documentation about extremism in school books, about praising so-called martyrs, terrorists, in naming youth centers, kindergartens. We have seen also what I will define as an indirect funding for terrorism, because Hamas, as a terrorist organization, is also the civil authority in the Gaza Strip. So every time the international society goes in and pays for schools, go in and pays for hospitals, go in and pay for basic necessities in a society, it frees up assets that the terrorist organization can use, for instance, on their tunnel work and on making military capabilities in rockets, in other homemade or homegrown weapon systems that we have seen Hamas use to, unfortunately, too much military gain in their terrorist attack. And that's the problem here. That is, the international society have fundamentally turned the blind eye to the fact that this aid is not helping the civil population. It is radicalizing the civil population. When we look at the opinions of Palestinians towards Israel, towards peaceful solution, the old generation that remembers back, maybe all the way back to 48, back to the old conflicts, are more sympathetic to a peaceful solution than the young generation that the UN have taught in their schools. So how can UN schools be a catalyst for more extremist views than the people who remember the time before the modern state of Israel was established after the atrocities of the Second World War. That maybe is, for me, the clearest example that the international society have failed. They have failed also the Palestinians, because this radicalized attitude where terrorists have more popular support in all polls that are conducted in Palestine than any moderate force goes to show that the road to a meaningful peace negotiation is very, very long, because it takes two to tango. It cannot only be a responsibility of Israel to create peace. It is a common, it has to be a common objective, a common goal, also from the Palestinian side, and it doesn't exist.
Let me just insert, and listening to Richard Kemp last night, you mentioned the tunnels, and it's amazing for us to consider that the tunnel system in Gaza, as you explained, is more extensive than the London Underground. It just blows one's mind to think, well, how did that happen, and who were financing, and it raises so many questions. But I want to move on in the conversation, Colonel Kemp. One of the objectives, of course, of the military operation in Gaza is to rescue the remaining, I think there are 138 hostages left, some of them, a significant part, dead by now. What is the state of play, would you say? Who are the main players that could make this happen? And how likely is a deal? We know that the Israelis met recently in Paris with some of the key stakeholders. What do you believe personally?
Yeah, and while we were talking about UNRWA just now, let's not forget that there have been reports of UNRWA staff holding some of the hostages in Gaza, or at least one of the hostages in Gaza. So their role is very clear, the role of at least some of the UNRWA staff. I've been involved in hostage rescue operations myself in Afghanistan and in Iraq of British citizens kidnapped by Islamic jihadists in those two countries. And it is an extremely difficult military operation to rescue hostages. And we've seen that as this war has unfolded over more than 3 months now. We've seen that, Israel's only actually managed to directly rescue a very tiny number of hostages. And unfortunately, some have been killed in the attempt to do so. And what's needed really is precise intelligence and surprise, the element of surprise, because of course the Hamas hostage takers are holding a gun to the heads of these people, and the minute there's a suspicion of a rescue operation, those are going to be the first to die, unfortunately. So rescuing them directly is going to be very tough, if not impossible, for the IDF. Military pressure, however, has led to the release of some of the hostages. It was only when Israel commenced its ground campaign and began to put real pressure on Hamas that Hamas eventually agreed to a ceasefire. In fact, they pushed for a ceasefire in order to give themselves some respite from Israel's military operation, and part of that was releasing hostages as a direct result of military pressure. I think the military pressure since then has built up, and according to the Israeli defense minister, the IDF have killed or wounded half of all Hamas terrorists in Gaza. That must be a phenomenal amount of pressure on them, not to mention the destruction of so much of their weaponry and their tunnel system. And I think they are at the point now where they might consider releasing further hostages. And I know these proposals have been put, but I think there's obviously considerable speculation about the extent to which Hamas is likely to go in that. They want to save their own skins. They know the only way they can save their own skins is if Israel ends its military operation. So I would guess the terms for any further hostage release are going to be, if not a complete cessation of Israeli operations in Gaza, then at least a very long-term cessation, perhaps for a period of months. But even if that occurs, will Hamas release all the hostages? I doubt it. They've got their leadership, people like Sinwar and Daif have got hostages all around them. There's can't give you evidence of that, but there's no question about it. That's their final protection against their own death or capture. And they're going to be hanging on to some of those hostages to protect themselves and their leadership. So it's possible that some form of negotiation could result in the release of more hostages, but I don't think by any means all of them. And one thing we need to be very cautious of or if Israel needs to be very cautious of, certainly, is if hostage release negotiations result in a long-term cessation of the Israeli offensive operations, then there's a real danger that Hamas could get away with, or that Israel will not succeed in destroying Hamas as an entity completely, because there will be international pressure to extend a ceasefire. So I think that's just one note of caution. Obviously, release of the hostages is fundamentally important, but it's also fundamentally important that Israel destroys Hamas.
Let me come back to diplomatic pressure. In this House, there was a famous case last year, Qatargate, emphasizing the role of Qatar in this building, in European politics. I believe personally that Qatar plays a key role. Someone that has not been given proper attention, I believe, is the mother of the current emir, Sheikha Mossa bin Nasser, who is really the soft power face of Qatar, the chair of the Qatar Foundation. And I think an appeal to a mother and someone who could sympathize with what it means to have children, even the 1-year-old Kfir Bibas, in these terrible conditions. This message should be going out to Qatar, and in particular to this very influential person. But Mr. Vistisen, you have seen firsthand here in the European Parliament the role of Qatar. What is your assessment? What could Qatar do more? Are they willing to do whatever is in their power to see a hostage release?
Qatar has positioned themselves for a long time as a funder of terrorism and to a certain extent an ally of Iran in the region, and also having this like Western face where they want big sporting events, want Western investment, want tourism, wants to have huge international commercial airlines, wants to fund big television stations that give the Western impression of a modernist movement in the Middle East or in the Gulf. So of course there is Qatar has put themselves as a key player in this, and it's very clear that many of these negotiations goes in the Qatari society. But on the long run, I think the best approach is to apply pressure, to say you cannot have this in-between position. Either you have to stand with the Western alliance and be part of that alliance, as we have seen. I think one of the reasons behind this terrorist attack was that Hamas was losing geopolitically in the region. We saw appeasement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. We saw appeasement between Bahrain with United Arab Emirates. We saw it also with Morocco. We saw that many key players in the Arab world was actually taking steps towards normalization with Israel, as we have seen Jordan and Egypt doing in the past. And I think from the Western world, we should emphasize in our diplomacy that there is no room for this two-faced approach. There is a room for either becoming part of the modern world, reaping all the benefits from the industrialized, capitalized world, or live in the Middle Ages, as certain parts of this region choose to do. And I think that is the pressure we need to apply for Qatar. But I think it was Golda Meir who said that we only get peace the day the Arabs love their own children more than they hate ours. And I think that's a fundamental truth here, that the hatred towards the Israelis goes so deep in certain parts of this society that it transcends the normal humanity that you could expect from a mother, from anyone who have a civic understanding of humanity.
Colonel Kemp, we just have a few minutes left of the program. I saved the most complex question to the last, but you only get 2 minutes. So what will happen now? What's the end game? How should Israel look at the future of Gaza? How should we look at the future of Gaza?
Well, let's assume that Hamas has been destroyed as a terrorist threat to Israel. It doesn't mean to say every single terrorist has been killed or captured, but it does mean that as an organization they're no longer a threat. Of course, that does not remove any future threat from Gaza to Israel, and Israel has to be very much aware of that. They have to make sure that a successor to Hamas does not arise or Hamas does not reinvent itself in some way, which is they're almost certain to try that, bearing in mind that a very significant part of the population, the majority of the population of Gaza, supports Hamas now, even though there are in some cases attempts by Gazan citizens to tell Hamas to stop doing what it's doing. Nevertheless, there is still a strong support and, of course, a hatred for Israel, which has only grown as a result of this conflict. So in sum, the IDF have to prevent that happening. They have to prevent the threat from resurging. And the only way they can do that, is to maintain military presence inside Gaza, military control of Gaza by the IDF. Whether that means a permanent military force there, like they have, for example, in areas of Judea and Samaria, or whether it means some other method, I don't know. But the IDF have to maintain control, security control. So whatever happens in terms of reconstruction, of governance of Gaza, or whatever, the IDF have to be there. They have to prevent this resurgence or the repeat of the 7th of October.
And I think in addition to a military solution, we also need this re-education, de-radicalization, whichever, peace education, whichever word we use, to bring people together and appreciate and accept coexistence. This brings us to the end of this edition of the European Report on day 116 after the bloody massacre of October 7. Let us pray and hope that next time we are here in the studio, all the remaining 132 hostages have been freed and back in safety and security. I want to thank our guests today, Anders Vistisen, Member of European Parliament for Denmark, and Colonel Richard Kemp. My name is Tomas Sandell. This has been the European Report, and we will see you again next month.